He never owned a compass. He never consulted a map. He never looked at a single star through any instrument made by human hands. And yet, for over 60 years, he crossed some of the most dangerous open ocean on Earth and never once lost his way. His name was Piailug, and when he died, something disappeared from this world that had taken 10,000 years to build. Close your eyes for just a moment and imagine being dropped into the middle of the Pacific Ocean. No land in sight, no GPS, no tools, nothing around you but water stretching to every horizon, a sky rotating overhead, and waves that rise and fall like the breathing of something alive beneath you. Most of us would be paralyzed. Most of us would have no idea which direction to look, which current to trust, or whether we were drifting towards salvation or the deep. Now imagine that this ocean, this terrifying, featureless, impossibly vast ocean, feels to you like a room in your own house. That was Piailug's reality. That was the world he inhabited. He did not navigate the ocean. He read it. He listened to it. He felt it move through the hull of a canoe, through the soles of his feet, through the skin on his arms and the hair on the back of his neck. The ocean spoke to him in a language so ancient it had no written alphabet, and he was one of the last human beings alive who could hear it. This is not a story about a talented sailor. This is a story about the last keeper of a way of knowing that stretches back further than the pyramids, further than recorded history, further than almost anything we think of as civilization. And it is a story about what happens when a way of knowing lives inside one body and that body grows old. It begins on a tiny island. Satawal is a dot of land in the Western Pacific, part of what is today the Federated States of Micronesia. It is roughly 1 mile long and half a mile wide. It sits in the middle of an ocean that covers 1/3 of the entire planet. From shore to shore, its beaches span maybe 20 minutes on foot. The people who live there have lived there for generations beyond counting. And for all of those generations, they survived not because they stayed on that small dot of land, but because they could leave it and come back. They could sail out into the blue nothing and find islands they could not see, using only the ocean itself as their guide. The tradition had a name: Itak, Pukov, the way of the navigator. It was taught in the dark, literally in the dark. When a young boy was chosen to become a palu, a master navigator, his training began in a small hut with no windows. The master would press the boy's hands flat against a flat piece of woven mat and tell him to feel the pattern being pressed into the other side. Slowly, the boy would begin to sense the shape of it. He was feeling the star paths. He was learning to hold the geometry of the sky in his fingertips before he ever tried to read it with his eyes. This was not metaphor. This was the method. Piailug was chosen young. His grandfather, who was already a master navigator of legendary reputation, saw something in the small boy that others could not name. There was an attentiveness about him, a stillness. When the other children played near the water, Mao would stand at the edge and watch the waves come in. Not to swim in them, not to splash through them, just to watch. His grandfather recognized that look. He had worn it himself once. And so the teaching began. First came the stars. Not the names we use in the West, not Orion or Cassiopeia or the Southern Cross as Europeans labeled them. The Carolinian navigation system had its own star map, its own star compass, a system of 32 star points arranged around the horizon, each one marking a direction, a path, a destination. Mao learned them all. He held them in his memory the way a musician holds a symphony, not as individual notes, but as a living whole structure that he could call up instantly in any condition, day or night, storm or calm. Then came the waves. This was the part that outsiders found almost impossible to comprehend. The Pacific Ocean is not a flat surface crossed by random wave patterns. It is a layered system of swells, each one generated by a specific distant weather event, each one traveling in a specific direction, each one with its own speed, its own frequency, its own feel. A practiced navigator can sense the deep ocean swell beneath the surface chop, the long, slow pulse of it, and use it like a compass needle. Even when clouds cover the stars, even in a storm, even in the dark. Mao could do this lying down in the canoe. He would stretch out in the hole, press his body flat, and feel the angles of swell crossing beneath him. His grandfather had taught him that the most sensitive place on the human body for detecting subtle wave motion was not the hands or the feet, but a specific place just below the sternum, the soft hollow at the base of the chest. He learned to breathe slowly, to still his own movement, and to feel the ocean's information traveling up through the wooden hole and into his body like a slow, constant conversation. The current came next. There are rivers inside the ocean, invisible highways of moving water that a trained eye can detect by looking at the surface texture, by watching the behavior of birds, by noticing where certain kinds of debris accumulate, by feeling the temperature change against the skin of the hand dragged gently in the water alongside the hole. Mao knew these currents the way a taxi driver knows city streets. He knew where they turned, where they slowed, where they ran strong and deep and dependable even in heavy weather. And the birds. The birds were always part of it. Different species fly at different distances from land. A master navigator reads the birds overhead the way a physician reads a chart. When certain birds appear, land is close. When others appear, it is far. When the behavior of a single bird changes, something has changed in the ocean beneath it. Mao watched birds the way other people watch clocks. By the time he was a teenager, he had already crossed open ocean alone. By his 20s, he was making the voyages between islands that other sailors feared. Passages that stretched hundreds of miles across open water with nothing visible between the departure point and the destination. He arrived. Every time. With a certainty that his passengers found almost eerie. People said he knew where he was going before he left. And in a very real sense, he did. The Carolinian navigation system does not work the way Western navigation works. A Western navigator plots his position. He asks, "Where am I?" Mao did not ask that question. The Carolinian system is built on a different cognitive framework entirely. The navigator holds his destination still in his mind and imagines the islands moving past him as he sails. He is always, in his own understanding, stationary. The world moves around him. He reads not his position, but the state of the world as it passes. Anthropologists who studied him in later years struggled to find language for this. It was not just technique. It was a different way of experiencing space and motion. A different relationship to the ocean itself. He did not think of the ocean as something to be crossed. He thought of it as something to be read. The tragedy begins, as so many tragedies begin, quietly. In the years after World War II, the islands of Micronesia were brought into contact with the modern world in ways that were profound and permanent. Government ships arrived on regular schedules. Then small aircraft. Then outboard motors. Then GPS. Each new technology was a gift of safety and speed and connection to the wider world, and each one made the old knowledge seem slightly less necessary. The young men of Satawal watched the ships come and go, and they wanted to be on them. They wanted engines. They wanted radios. They wanted the future. This was not foolishness. This was the entirely reasonable desire of human beings to have access to the tools that could make their lives easier and safer. But tools carry hidden costs. When you stop using a skill, you stop passing it on. When the young men of Satawal stopped sailing in traditional canoes, they stopped sitting at the feet of the old navigators. When they stopped sitting at those feet, the old men stopped teaching. Not out of stubbornness, but because there was no one asking to learn. The knowledge did not die suddenly. It faded. Slowly, the way a fire fades when you stop feeding it wood, so gradually that no one moment feels like a crisis until one morning you wake up and the embers are cold. By the 1970s, Piailug looked around the islands he had known all his life and realized that he was, in some terrible and absolute sense, alone. The other men who had been trained as Palu navigators were old. Some were dead, and none of them had passed the full system on to younger practitioners. The tradition that stretched back 10,000 years to the first Austronesian sailors who crossed from Asia into the Pacific and found island after island using nothing but their bodies and the ocean, that tradition was almost gone. It lived in its complete form in one man. He was in his 40s. He was healthy, but he was not immortal. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary rescues of endangered knowledge in the modern era. In 1973, a group of researchers and cultural preservationists began working toward a project that seemed, to many observers, completely insane. They wanted to build a traditional Hawaiian voyaging canoe, the kind that had not sailed deep ocean in centuries, and use it to sail from Hawaii to Tahiti, roughly 2,400 miles of open Pacific, using only traditional Polynesian navigation methods. The problem was that traditional Polynesian navigation was functionally extinct in Hawaii. The knowledge had been lost there even more thoroughly than it had been lost in Micronesia. There was no one on the Hawaiian Islands who could do what needed to be done. And then someone said the name Piailug. The canoe was called Hokule'a, the Star of Gladness. And on the morning of May 1st, 1976, it left Honolulu Harbor carrying a crew that included sitting quietly in the bow with no instruments and no maps, a man from a small island that most of the world had never heard of. What followed was a demonstration that people who witnessed it described as witnessing something almost impossible. 33 days later, Hokule'a arrived in Tahiti. Mao had navigated the entire passage using only stars, swells, clouds, birds, and the accumulated wisdom of 10,000 years. When the canoe entered the harbor at Papeete, 4,000 people were waiting on the shore. They had heard what was coming. Some of them were weeping before the canoe had even landed. Those people understood something in their bones that the academic world was only beginning to process. This was not a demonstration of a quaint old skill. This was proof that their ancestors had been, in some deeply important sense, magnificent, that the settlement of the Pacific, the greatest migration in human history, carried out across millions of square miles of open ocean, long before any other civilization had dared venture out of sight of land, had been accomplished not by accident, not by lucky drift, but by knowledge, deliberate, disciplined, extraordinary knowledge, and one man still carried it. In the years that followed, Mao became something he had never expected to become, a teacher to the world. He sailed Hokule'a again and again. He trained Hawaiian navigators. He trained researchers. He sat in classrooms and community centers and on the decks of canoes, and he tried, with enormous patience and enormous generosity, to translate into words what he had always known in his body. It was harder than any ocean crossing. The things he knew were not, in their deepest essence, verbal. They had been transmitted through touch, through demonstration, through years of shared experience on the water. The feeling of a swell pattern beneath the sternum, The way the air smells different when land is 2 days away. The specific quality of silence that falls over the ocean when a storm is building over the horizon. These were not things he had ever had to put into sentences. They lived in him below language. He tried anyway. And what he managed to transmit was not the whole thing, the living, breathing wholeness of the system as he had received it from his grandfather, but it was something. It was enough to rekindle a tradition in Hawaii that had been cold for generations. It was enough to inspire a generation of Pacific voyagers who went on to do remarkable things. It was enough to ensure that something, some genuine transmission of the knowledge, survived him. But Mao knew with a quiet and private grief he rarely spoke about that it was not the whole thing. There was knowledge he carried that he had never been able to convey, ways of reading the ocean that existed in his senses and not in his words, subtle indicators that he recognized and responded to without being able to explain the recognition. The knowledge that lived in his feet, his chest, his hands, the knowledge that his grandfather had pressed into him in a dark hut through a woven mat so many decades ago, that knowledge was not fully transmissible through classroom instruction. It required the transmission method it had always required. Years, childhood, the gradual absorption of a whole way of being in the world. And there was no child on Satawal who was being raised the way Mao had been raised. He returned to Satawal in his later years. He built canoes. He sat on the shore in the evenings and looked out at the water the way he always had. Those who knew him well said he seemed in those years both at peace and quietly heartbroken. At peace because he had done what he could. He had kept the knowledge alive. He had carried it across decades when it might have died in silence, and he had offered it to the world with both hands. Heartbroken because he knew what he was taking with him. Every master navigator before him had died knowing that what they passed on was essentially whole, that the young man sitting at their feet had received the complete thing. Mao Piailug was the first in the long lineage who could not make that claim. He died on July 12, 2010. He was 78 years old. He died on his island, the small dot of land in the middle of the biggest ocean on Earth. The island whose shoreline he had memorized as a child, and whose surrounding waters he had known, in his body, better than any place on land. The people who loved him said that in his final months, when he could no longer go to sea, he would sit for hours at the water's edge. Just sitting, not speaking. Feeling, perhaps, the vibration of distant swells coming through the sand, the old information still arriving even when there was nothing left to do with it. When Hokule'a completed its circumnavigation of the globe in 2017, the crew dedicated the voyage to Mao Piailug. They sailed the final leg into Honolulu Harbor and they wept. The navigators he had trained, the sailors whose entire relationship to the ocean had been transformed by knowing him, they stood on the deck of the canoe he had made possible, and they felt his absence as a specific, named, located thing. Not the absence of a teacher, the absence of a world. We talk sometimes about endangered languages. We understand, at least in principle, that when the last speaker of a language dies, something is lost that cannot be recovered, that the world has lost a way of parsing human experience that existed nowhere else. We understand this. We feel the sadness of it. What we talk about less is endangered knowledge of the body. Ways of perceiving and being in the world that are not stored in books or databases or recordings, but in muscles and nerves, and the slow accumulation of sensory experience across a lifetime of practice. Knowledge that cannot be downloaded or archived or preserved in a museum case. Knowledge that lives only in living human beings and passes from one living body to another, or it does not pass at all. Piailug carried 10,000 years of that kind of knowledge. He carried the sensory inheritance of every navigator who had ever sailed from a Micronesian or Polynesian island and found their destination in the open ocean with nothing but their body and their understanding of the world. He carried the specific and unrepeatable experience of a man who had spent 60 years in a conversation with the Pacific Ocean. And when he died, that conversation ended. The navigators he trained are real. They are skilled. They sail Hokule'a and other traditional canoes across thousands of miles of open ocean, and they do extraordinary things. The tradition lives in some important sense. This is not nothing. This is, in fact, a kind of miracle. But they themselves will tell you that what they do is not quite what Mao did, that there is a quality of knowing that he had, a directness and depth of sensory reading that they approach but do not fully reach, that the system they practice is a reconstruction, a genuine and vital reconstruction, but a reconstruction nonetheless of something that in its original form was different from any reproduction. You cannot replicate the 10,000 hours a boy spent on the water before he could speak in full sentences. You cannot replicate the feel of a grandfather's hands pressing star paths into a child's palms in a dark room. You cannot replicate the specific weight of a tradition carried in an unbroken line from the first sailors who looked at the horizon and decided to cross it. There is a moment that people who spent time with Mao described again and again. You would be sailing with him, far out at sea, no land visible in any direction, and you would watch him stand in the bow of the canoe and look out at the water. Not scanning, not searching, just looking, the way you look at a familiar face. And then, without drama, without performance, without consulting anything but the water itself and whatever he felt in his body, he would say simply, quietly, "Land is there." And it was. That moment, that specific human capacity, that way of being so deeply known to a place that the place itself speaks to you in a language no one had to invent, is gone from this world now. We sent probes to the edges of the solar system. We mapped the human genome. We built machines that can beat our best minds at chess. And we lost. In a small hut on a small island in the middle of the largest ocean on Earth, a way of knowing that our most sophisticated instruments still cannot fully replicate. Mao Piailug did not navigate the ocean. He was, in some ancient and irreducible sense, at home in it. And home is not a skill you can teach in a classroom. Home is a place you grow up knowing, in your bones, before you know anything else. He was the last person alive for whom the Pacific Ocean was home in that complete and wordless way. And somewhere tonight, the swells he used to feel are still moving, still traveling their deep invisible paths across the water, still carrying the same information they always carried, patient and indifferent and eternal, waiting for a body that knows how to listen.